Welcome to our conference, Marine Corps Actions Shaping History, and the Naval Institute is honored to be co-host of this event with the United States Naval Academy. We are deeply appreciative of the sponsorship of the William M. Wood Foundation. Without their support, we would not have been able to bring you this program. Special welcome to the MIDs who are present here, and more MIDs will be joining us through the day as they rotate from their classes. It's been a privilege to work with three talented Marines in the buildup of this conference: Lieutenant Colonel Amy McGrath, Major John Naughton, and Captain Corey Camp. We thank them. President Ronald Reagan once said that some people spend an entire lifetime wondering if they made a difference in the world, but Marines don't have that problem. The Marine Corps has been part of the Naval Institute since 1873, when 15 people, Navy and Marines, founded the Naval Institute. They saw a Navy and a Marine Corps that was in disrepair. They saw a Navy and the Marine Corps where ideas were not moving easily up and down the chain of command, and they set about to do something. They founded the U.S. Naval Institute, and they said that your ideas don't depend on what you're wearing here. It depends on what you're wearing here. When they collected enough information that they thought was worthy for the profession, they published them in a journal called Proceedings starting in 1874. Throughout its long history of 141 years of continuous publication, Proceedings has featured the likes of Major General and Commandant Lejeune, who wrote each year in the 1920s when he was in charge about the state of the Marine Corps. Major General John Henry Russell Jr., who first as ACMAC and then as Commandant, put forward the ideas that begat the concepts of the Fleet Marine Force, and indeed ended up writing the blueprint for how we fought World War II in the Pacific with the Marines. Our pages featured Colonel Robert Heinel, who in the early 50s to the early 60s was a stalwart who pushed back incredibly effectively with his pen to those who said, we don't need a Marine Corps. And right down to the present day, where people like General Gray submitted himself for interviews in Proceedings, and General Amos, who just recently left as Commandant, had 3 articles in Proceedings discussing the fact that the modern Marines have as much or more to bring today than they ever have in their history. So this program allows for a face-to-face conversation, which will be important, and I'm very glad that we were able to bring it to you. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Vice Admiral Ted Carter. Vice Admiral Carter is the class of '81. He was designated a naval aviator in 1982. He was assigned to the F-14 Tomcat community. He's a veteran of the Fighter Weapons School and Top Gun. He flew in combat in Bosnia, Kosovo, Kuwait, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He commanded the Combat Logistics Force ship Camden. He commanded the carrier Carl Vinson and the Enterprise Strike Group. He served previously as the 54th president of the Naval War College. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm proud to present the 62nd Superintendent of the U.S. Naval Academy. Let's welcome Admiral Ted Carter.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Annapolis. It's really great to see all these wonderful faces here. In my world here in leading the Naval Academy, I have the opportunity to speak all over the country, and today I'm really honored to be just a small part of the Naval Institute's presentation today. I think this is significant, it's relevant, talking about United States Marines Shaping History. As you think about what we are experiencing right now, we just had the Navy's 240th birthday yesterday. Happy birthday to the U.S. Navy. And in just a few weeks, on the 10th of November, we're going to celebrate the Marine Corps' 240th birthday. And of course, for all of us here at the Naval Academy, just 4 days ago, this last Saturday on October 10th, we celebrated our 170th birthday as a U.S. Naval Academy. And over our 170 years, we have changed a little bit. And in fact, I'm proud to say today, I have a Marine Corps Colonel, and Steve Lazuski, who's here, you'll hear him a little bit later today, who's serving as the Commandant of Midshipmen. It's only the second time in Naval Academy history that's happened. In fact, the first time it's happened is from a gentleman you're going to hear today, General John Allen, class of 1976 here at the Naval Academy, who served as the Commandant here. And that's important because today the Naval Academy is producing about 25% of all the second lieutenants who get commissioned into the Marine Corps every year. And that's been going on now for about 15 years. So that's a little bit of a change. And I would tell you, as I look at General Amos here, who was a Commandant of the Marine Corps from 2010 to 2014, that the relationship between the Navy and the Marine Corps has probably never been better. And we're part of that here at the Naval Academy. So I'm very proud that we are hosting this along with the Naval Institute here today. And I want to thank Vice Admiral Pete Daly and the entire Naval Institute team, along with the William Wood Foundation, who is sponsoring this, to bring just a spectacular list of speakers that you're going to get to hear today. Former Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Al Gray, who was a Commandant from 1987 to 1991, along with General Amos. I mean, two great senior leaders. You're going to have an active duty 3-star Lieutenant General and Ron Bailey, who will be here. And of course, Lieutenant General Fred McCorkle, who was the Deputy Commandant for Aviation, call sign Assassin. I expect that somebody's going to ask about that and make sure they get that history. They're going to just be part of the panel that you're going to hear today. And then this afternoon, you're going to get to hear from the senior enlisted non-commissioned officers, as well as some of our junior captains who have actually served in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. So all of this will serve to connect the dots to understand a little bit about where we've been, going back to World War II to the present. And this idea of history, especially here at places where I've been at the Naval War College and here at the Naval Academy, is so crucial. I'm really encouraged to see some of our college students and high school students here, because this type of conference is not here to try to get you to recruit to become a Marine, at least I hope not. But it is intended to inspire you to have this understanding that without knowledge of history, we can't possibly understand why and how we got to where we are today. And we have little chance of mapping our future going forward if we don't understand how we've got to where we are. There's a lot been talked about here over the last 7 years about how we create a maritime strategy for the Navy, the Marine Corps, our Coast Guard. And I would submit to you, it's symposia like this that don't end in just the day's conversation. It continues on in tweets and blogs, in writings, in books, so that we can help develop the future strategy of the Navy and the Marine Corps. And as I think about our path forward, the mission of the Navy and the Marine Corps is resonating with our country more than ever. I see it as the superintendent here in the tail end of the millennial generation that's asking to come here to the Naval Academy to attend. Not just because they want to be at the Naval Academy, but because they want to serve something bigger than themselves, and they want to go into the Navy and the Marine Corps. So this is particularly germane to the conversation going forward. I'm very thankful to be a small part of it. Please enjoy the symposium all day today. My second task here is to introduce our first guest speaker. Richard B. Frank is a graduate of the University of Missouri, 1969, and Georgetown University Law Center in 1976. He is a Vietnam veteran, having served with the 101st Airborne Division as a rifle platoon leader. He has been an independent scholar most of his life, specializing in Asia-Pacific War. In 1990, he published his first book, Guadalcanal. It won the General Wallace M. Green Jr. Award for the best book about the Marine Corps history that year. His second work, Downfall, The End of the Imperial Japanese Empire, appeared in 1999. It won the Harry S. Truman Book Award and has been called one of the 6 best books in English about World War II. It's an amazing statement. Both those Random House books became main selections of the History Book Club, and in 2007 he completed MacArthur as a part of the Paul Grave Great General series. Besides his numerous appearances on television and radio, he was a consultant for the epic HBO miniseries, The Pacific. He serves on the board of presidential counselors of the U.S. National World War II Museum, and this April, he became the head of that body. He is the principal historical consultant for the museum's new major exhibit titled The Road to Tokyo, which will open in December of 2015. He is currently working on a narrative history trilogy about the Asia-Pacific War dating from 1937 to 1945 for Random House. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to Annapolis Mr. Richard B. Frank.
Thank you, sir. Good morning. It's great to be here. Before I get into the main part of my talk, I want to talk about the first time I attempted to come to the U.S. Naval Academy. I was much impressed as a young fellow by Samuel Eliot Morrison's great histories of naval operations in World War II and decided I'd like to become a naval officer. I applied to come to Annapolis and very shortly was informed that my eyesight was not up to the standards of the United States Naval Academy. The Army later proved to be less discriminating in this regard. 25 years later, I published my first book about Guadalcanal. A number of commentators have observed that among the sub-themes in that volume is a lovingly detailed stories of the failures of various Annapolis-trained naval officers. It's been suggested that there's a connection between that sub-theme and my earlier rejection by the Naval Academy. I can only respond to that by saying no comment. I want to tell you also there's a very personal reason why I want to be here today because of a connection I have with the U.S. Marine Corps. When I was in Vietnam, in the spring of 1972, John Ripley, with incredible heroism, blew up a bridge at Dong Ha, halting the North Vietnamese Easter Offensive. That act, and some very hard fighting by South Vietnamese armed forces, accounts for the fact that I'm here alive today. And so I want to dedicate these particular remarks to John. I got an opportunity to personally thank John through the auspices of the Naval Institute. He was a great American, and he is very much missed. Are we ready? Here's how we're going to proceed. This is my own idiosyncratic top 10 list. We're going to go from 10 down to 1, and we're going to do it with a little audience participation. I'm going to say number, and you're going to recite the correct number. So let's go. Number. You guys took a vow of silence. Let's try again. Number. They validated a generation. In the summer of 1942, no one was using the phrase, the greatest generation. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan held themselves out to be the great warrior nations of that time, or perhaps all time. And between the late 1930s and that summer, there was a lot of evidence that showed that this was not an idle boast. On 7 August 1942, the 1st Marine Division, reinforced, landed on the obscure island of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. This commenced an epic 6-month-long battle marked by almost continuous fighting in the air, on the ground, and at sea. It was also marked by incredible oscillations of fortune. The stranded Marines found themselves repeatedly hanging on by their fingernails and at certain junctures by their eyelashes. The American public viewed this as the first fair test of their youth and to whether they could meet and defeat the youth of the Axis powers. Only at Guadalcanal were Americans engaged with the Axis powers on any meaningful scale from August to November 1942. It became the #1 story on radio and in the newspapers. The near daily perils faced by the Americans on and around the island riveted the American public. By mid-October, in Washington, it was widely believed that the garrison on Guadalcanal was doomed. The New York Times wrote an editorial for the Americans on Guadalcanal that reads like a eulogy. But the Marines, with the help of some soldiers and a lot of Navy blood, did prevail. Later, James Jones, who was arguably the greatest novelist of that generation, would set his own autobiographical novel, The Thin Red Line, on Guadalcanal. And he did so because, as he reported, What Guadalcanal stood for to Americans in 1942-43 was a very special thing. To have used a completely made-up island would have been to lose all of those special qualities that the name Guadalcanal evoked for my generation. Now, the great documentary series Victory at Sea reflected how that generation regarded the war they fought. In the final frames of the stirring episode on Guadalcanal, the narrator captures that very special significance of that campaign to that generation as he intones to scenes of Marines leaving Guadalcanal the following words. To these men go the honors accorded to the Greeks at Thermopylae, the Colonials at Valley Forge, the British at Waterloo, and now the Americans at Guadalcanal. What Jones and Victory at Sea episodes meant to all the young Americans who had fought and prevailed later was that they knew that they stood on the shoulders of those who had fought at Guadalcanal. In that fashion, those Marines validated a generation. Number? Now, the record of the Marines in World War II speaks for itself. As much as that record deserves our respect and honor, I think it's vital to remember that they did not fight the Pacific War alone. Let me count just some of the ways in which other actors contributed. While it has not yet broken through much, certainly either in scholarly or popular literature, we have now for the last 15 years been benefiting from the tremendous release of archival documentation from China, which has radically altered our understanding of what China contributed to that war. The basic facts are these. When major hostilities began in 1937 with Japan, almost no one in the world believed that the Chinese would be able to sustain combat for more than a few weeks or at most a few months. But the Chinese remained in the war for 8 long years, and they did so with little or no outside help. And China suffered tremendously. By conservative count, about 15 million Chinese died. 12 million of them were non-combatants. China also sustained tremendous devastation to our most economically developed areas. But China continued to tie down no fewer than 600,000 to more generally about 1 million Japanese soldiers throughout the entire war. Now, it's true that the Japanese lacked the shipping to simply pick up 1 million men and move them anywhere they wanted. But they certainly had enough capacity to move some tens of thousands of them about. Suppose the garrison at Saipan had held 40 or 60,000 Japanese instead of 30,000, or that Iwo Jima's garrison had been, say, 30,000 compared to the just over 20,000 it was. All of this would have made for a much, much tougher war. The relationships of the Marines and the U.S. Army ground forces, to say the least, was mixed. Army units participated in all the major Marine campaigns, either as major ground units or as battalion-sized support units. The Marine-Army relationship touched a nadir in June 1945 when Marine Lieutenant General Holland Smith, the commander of the 5th Amphibious Corps, relieved Army Major General Ralph Smith, the commander of the 27th Infantry Division. This became an infamous popular controversy referred to as the Smith versus Smith controversy. Yet afterwards, in that same campaign at Guam, the Marine 3rd Amphibious Corps worked famously and effectively with the Army 77th Infantry Division. And the commander of that unit, Major General Andrew Bruce, became an officer highly regarded by both the Army and the Marines. Then we come to the U.S. Army Air Forces. Moving on to the U.S. Coast Guard, I note the Coasties manned in transports and landing craft throughout the Pacific campaigns. And all of those who contributed to the Marine success, the smallest outfit who made the biggest contribution were the Australian Coast Watchers. They operated behind Japanese lines with no prospect of survival if captured. They observed and reported by radio Japanese shipping and air movements, and it's no exaggeration to say that Guadalcanal could not have been held were it not for the Australian Coast Watchers and their early warnings of Japanese air raids. Then we come to the U.S. Navy. The Navy was indispensable. It took the Marines to their objectives, it provided air and fire support, and like the Marines, was on a learning curve throughout the Pacific campaigns. Now, Guadalcanal became indelibly associated with the Marine Corps and the 1st Marine Division, and early on the Marines had ample reason for complaint about the support they received or did not receive from the Navy. But the fact is that as the campaign wobbled on through one crisis after another, eventually the Navy paid with a tremendous effusion of blood. Basically, for every Marine or soldier who died on Guadalcanal, almost 3 sailors would perish. And I want to illustrate that statistic with a specific story about the cruiser Juno. She was damaged in a furious night action on November 13th, 1942. The following day, during retirement, she was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine and blew up with a tremendous explosion. There were about 100 to 120 men left in the water, and their story of attempted survival in the face of the sun and the conditions of the sea is very stark. It became even starker when they began to experience shark attacks. One of the only 10 men who eventually survived the sinking, and 683 died with the Juno, including the 5 Sullivan brothers, provided this account of what happened during that ordeal. One of the young sailors, whose shifting position was attacked by a shark, and that shark gouged out his entire shoulder structure, leaving an arm hanging only by a couple shreds of flesh. And Lester Zook reported what happened next. He looked at his shipmates there and realized that he was making them nauseated, that he was driving them crazy by just being there, and the sharks were getting around close in the water because of his blood being there. And knowingly, he pushed himself off the life nets and swam out about 5 or 6 feet and let the sharks have him, rather than lay there and die like a coward and jeopardize the lives of his shipmates. Number 8. From after World War I, the Navy foresaw a future conflict in the Pacific with Japan. The League of Nations mandates had given the Japanese control of island groups, the Marshalls, the Carolines, and part of the Marianas, and that plus the limitations of naval treaties on ship numbers and qualities made the Navy recognize that they were facing a step-by-step advance across the Pacific, and they would need advanced bases. The Marine Corps at the same time was looking for a mission beyond serving as an additional source of infantry as it had in World War I. And based upon a prescient conceptual paper by Major Pete Ellis, the Marine Corps leadership steered the Corps toward that mission of seizing and defending advanced bases. And one feature particularly set this concept apart. It included assault landings against defended beaches. Now, in December 1943, they formed the Fleet Marine Force, which would be the tactical organization to carry out that mission. And the following month, it published the now famous tentative manual for landing operations as a guide to how to do those things they called a landing against opposition. Historians and many others have written to extol the German concept of blitzkrieg warfare. That involves combined arms operations under air cover, but blitzkrieg only involved 2 dimensions of warfare, on the ground and in the air. The amphibious war U.S. forces would wage across the Pacific were 3-dimensional, involving sea, air, and ground. And it also included a stupendous logistical challenge of projecting forces thousands of miles from the nearest base to locations bereft of the most elementary development like roads, bridges, or habitation. The celebrated British historian J.F.C. Fuller thus had no trouble calling the U.S. development amphibious war, quote, the most far-ranging tactical innovation of World War II. The larger point, I think, is this. I don't think you can find another episode in American military history where the leadership of services foresaw with great clarity the kind of war they would fight 2 decades later. That's a claim that can only be made by the U.S. Marines and the Navy about their anticipation of the Pacific War. Now, the Marine Corps leadership also made another critical decision during this period that shaped the future of the Corps. They recognized correctly that aviation was here to stay, and they sought to make aviation part of the Marine Corps in an air-ground team. The Army confronted the same doctrinal question. It likewise acquired an air arm, the Army Air Corps, but there was a huge difference. The Marines looked to fuse their air arm with their other arms to make their vision of a unified air command, air-ground team. The Army allowed autonomy to its flyers, and those airmen subordinated ground support missions to other missions. Number 7. Sorry, stepped on you, didn't I? During the last hours, of the approach to Guadalcanal, the amphibious force commander Richmond Kelly Turner remembered the words of a well-known military critic, Liddell Hart, who had written, quote, a landing on a foreign shore in the face of hostile troops has always been one of the most difficult operations of war. It has now become almost impossible. Hart's comment reflected the widely held view that an amphibious assault in modern times against an enemy equipped with machine guns and light artillery was suicidal. And Exhibit A for that proposition was deemed to be the Gallipoli campaign in World War I. This was the disastrous British effort with British, Australian, New Zealand, and French troops to capture the Dardanelles. But the Marines very carefully studied Gallipoli and correctly concluded that it was not the basic concept, but the execution that doomed the enterprise. They meticulously attacked the myriad problems presented by a landing on a distant shore, defended or undefended, and worked out solutions to each challenge. They also worked with the Navy to develop the ships and the landing craft to carry out those missions. Now, there are a couple of things about this that I think are very impressive. First, the Marines were prepared to look at not just at recent history, but also at recent alleged failure. And secondly, they examined this with complete intellectual honesty and dissected it between concept and execution and simply refused to accept what was supposedly the lesson of the Dardanelles, that such operations were doomed to failure. Now, there was another way the World War II Marines used history. Their historical volumes on operations during World War II reflect a very careful and diligent effort. They record not only what went right, but often what went wrong and why. And their summaries after operations set out in clear language the lessons learned. But beyond these attributes, those histories contain something else. The official Marine Corps history of World War II is the only American and the only Allied official history that includes an account of Marines held as prisoners of war. Thus, those history volumes convey not only the events, but the values of the Marine Corps. Number? Here we go. I'm sorry. You got me excited here, whatever. American military history prior to World War II contains many examples of operations in which the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy worked together to achieve a mission. But the command relations of those enterprises were based on cooperation of commanders of different services, not subordination of components of one service to the commanders of another service. General George C. Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, mounted a concerted effort after Pearl Harbor to assure that the principle of unity of command would apply to all Allied overseas theaters, but this left room for autonomy at the operational and tactical level. Now, the Marine air units that got to Guadalcanal experienced the relentless pressure of the Japanese, and that brought a steady stream of reinforcements. Soon the Marines were joined by flyers from the Navy, usually from damaged or sunken carriers, and from a small but brave contingent of Army Air Force flyers who could not contribute the way they desired because of the deficiencies of their assigned aircraft. This overall command became known as the Cactus Air Force. Cactus was the code name for Guadalcanal. Marine officers would command the Cactus Air Force throughout the campaign as it grew and amalgamated more and more aviators of other services. By November, it was routine to put up mixed formations, particularly of Navy and Marine Corps aircraft, with Air Force aircraft playing whatever role they could. In 1943, this command became known as Aircraft Solomons. This, I would point out, was the first true joint command in American military history. It would rotate commanders from Navy to Army Air Force to Marine officers. Its staff was completely integrated of officers of all services. At the tactical level, its missions were mounted, merging aircraft from all three aviation components, later joined by New Zealand fighter squadrons, and formations flew aircraft from different services, reflecting the respective capabilities and limitations of those aircraft types. Now, there's another story about jointness in the Marines in World War II that I find is wonderfully strange and weird and instructive. But to tell it, you must have the proper attire. General Douglas MacArthur reached the Philippines in October 1944, and by January 45 was on Luzon. He learned that about 4,000 civilian internees and prisoners of war, mostly American, were being held at the Santo Tomas University in Manila. Their condition was deteriorating rapidly, and it was believed with good reason that they were in serious danger of being executed by the Japanese. General MacArthur needed one of his units to ride to the rescue. he turned to the 1st Cavalry Division, for who else would you send to ride to the rescue but the U.S. Cavalry? He ordered the commander to get to Manila with some of his units and liberate the internment camp as rapidly as possible. The 1st Cavalry Division launched 2 what they called flying columns. These were battalion-sized teams with numerous attached elements. For steeds, they'd left their ponies behind in the States. They climbed on wheel-to-track vehicles. And the flying columns burst through Japanese lines and commenced a wild, hell-for-leather 3-day ride behind Japanese lines on main roads, side roads, and no roads. Now, who else would you send on a ride to the rescue? Why, the U.S. Marines, of course. There were no Marine ground units present, but there were 2 Marine air groups with 7 squadrons of SBD Dauntless dive bombers. And pretty soon they had 9 SBDs continuously over each column. The Marine aviators were scouting ahead of the columns, identifying the roads, Japanese opposition, delivering pinpoint attacks against certain Japanese resistance, and above all, guarding the flanks of both of those flying columns as they rode hell for leather towards Manila. Marine controllers in radio-equipped jeeps moved near the front of the flying columns, and the radios permitted direct and immediate contact with the overhead Marine planes, and pretty soon the commanders of both the flying columns were seated in those Marine jeeps where they had instantaneous contact with their aerial scouts. Now, one of those flying columns encountered a bridge that had been rigged by the Japanese for demolition. Well, the cavalrymen pulled out of their saddlebags a naval officer who was an explosive ordnance demolition specialist and graciously permitted him to charge out on the exposed bridge under direct Japanese fire to extinguish the burning fuse on the demolition charge. That's jointness in operation. This mission ended in Hollywood fashion. The U.S. Cavalry and the Marines had ridden to the rescue, and the internees and the POWs, about 4,000 of them, were liberated on Santo Tomas. If John Ripley had been here, he would have asked me to get a volunteer from the audience, but the Navy insisted I use a block of wood. That's a K-bar fighting knife. It was issued individually to Marines during World War II in the Pacific. Most of them, of course, spent their time in the mundane tasks of housekeeping out in the wilds, but they also represented the fact that the Marines were prepared for the most primitive face-to-face kind of fighting, because this is the kind of fighting the Japanese enforced. The centerpiece of Japanese tactics was relentless night infiltration. They would dispatch individuals or small groups wherever possible at night in the Marine lines with the twin objectives of psychological intimidation and physical exhaustion. At places like Tarawa, many Marines actually stayed awake for the entire 72 hours of the operation because they knew they must be on alert 24/7 against Japanese infiltrators bent upon leaping into their holes and killing them with a knife. But if the K-bar represented the most primitive type of warfare, the Marines also leaped to exploit many types of technology in what we now call combat multipliers. Now, World War II produced a vast catalog of ground, air, and sea advancements in technology, from atomic bombs to hand weapons. But if you're looking for a technology that surmounted an array of contradictory physical challenges, for my money, the hands-down winner would be the landing vehicle tracked. Now, the genesis of that was with the eccentric Donald Roebling, a member of a multi-generation family of brilliant engineers. He was inspired by the need for a rescue vehicle that could save lives after a 1928 Florida hurricane. He set out to develop a vehicle capable of crawling over obstacles or propelling itself through the water. He used family funds, and he made the critical conceptual breakthrough of a vehicle with tracks that could crawl over obstacles or through the mud, and with cup-shaped blades on the tracks that could propel the vehicle through the water. An article in Life magazine alerted the Navy and Marine leadership to Roebling's concept, and it served as a solution to one of the most daunting tactical challenges they would face in the Pacific, an assault that required a machine that could swim through the open ocean without capsizing or sinking, crawl over coral reefs, and land through surf on a beach. Now, it's not much to look at, and we take it for granted today, but when you really think about the three things that that machine had to do, it is absolutely an astonishing technological breakthrough. Quite simply, the Central Pacific campaigns could not have been conducted without the LVT. And although the vehicle started life as a logistical support vehicle, starting at Tarawa with improvised armor, it became an assault vehicle and became a centerpiece of Marine Corps operations. Now, on another notable technological front, the Marine Corps planned from the start to have a tank battalion with every division. The U.S. Army never raised enough tank battalions to assure that there was one for each division, and admitted after the war that this had been a major mistake in the Army's formation of its ground forces. The standard tank by 1944 was the M4 Sherman, and during that summer of 1944, the Marines were showing far higher levels of infantry tank cooperation than the U.S. Army was in Europe. As early as the Munda campaign in August 1943, Marine tankers solved one of the most difficult problems of infantry tank cooperation. They rigged up field phone to the intercom system of a tank so that infantrymen could actually talk to the buttoned-up tankers. It took the Army about 10 more months to figure out that solution. Number. There's a periodically flaming debate among historians of the European phase of World War II over whether the German infantry were tactically much superior to the British and American counterparts, and if so, why this was so. So what does this have to do with Marines in the Pacific? Well, the answer is it tells an important story about how Marine leaders paid very careful attention to shaping the sharp edge of the Marine Corps, the rifle company, with adequate tools. Now, basically, an Army infantry company in 1944 had 6 officers and 189 men, and they were organized in 3 rifle platoons and a weapons platoon. But the Army saw to it that the Army infantry company in the assault had only 2 Browning 30 caliber light machine guns to support its infantry as they went forward. A German rifle company was authorized 14 machine guns. These were either the MG-34 or the MG-42. The MG-34 fired about twice as fast as the Browning, and the MG-42 fired about 3 times as fast as the Browning. To me, it's been obvious for a long time that if you're facing that much of a deficiency in firepower at the front edge, you're going to have major problems trying to advance. Basically, the Germans had 7 times as many barrels and between 14 and 21 times as much density of fire from machine guns as an Army rifle company. So you can see why only small groups of Germans could hold off an entire rifle company. Now, the Marine Corps had started out in 1942 also only equipping a rifle company with only 2 machine guns. By 1943, that number was up to 3, and in 1944, that number was up to 6, which is to say that there were 2 machine guns for every 3 rifle squads in a Marine rifle company. Now, there are a lot of factors that enabled the Marines to succeed in World War II, and a large part of them, of course, were intangibles. But careful attention to gaining and maintaining firepower superiority at the very front edge of the battle area was one of the most important facets that led to Marine success in World War II. And it started at the top. Let's try this again. Number. 3. Good. Now, equipping a rifle company with adequate machine guns was one facet of how Marine leaders maximized the effectiveness of their frontline units. But they also looked down below the company level. As one historian wrote, it was to the eternal credit of the Marine Corps hierarchy that the rifle squad received, quote, detailed scrutiny by Marine general officers, unquote. And to me, this is a fascinating story of institutional development that sought to maximize the effectiveness of individual Marines. The Marines started the war with a rifle squad that had a squad leader, an assistant squad leader, and 1 BAR man per squad. There were 9 men in the squad. You couldn't break the squad down any lower than that. In 1943, there was a reorganization. They moved the squad size up to 12. Now you had a squad leader, an assistant squad leader, and 2 BR men. And you could break the squad down into 2 6-man teams, which was better, but still not adequate. Now, meanwhile, the Marines, historically, from the bottom up, had been working on the issue of how to organize at the lowest levels. Lieutenant Merritt Edson, later famous as a Marine raider and a Major General, had begun organizing his unit in the Banana Wars with 3- and 4-man fire groups with one man carrying an automatic weapon. And the Marines in China, when organizing for riot duty, had broken down their rifle platoons into 6 4-man teams, also to decentralize and gain flexibility. Thus, the seeds of both decentralization and command at squad level and the importance of firepower were recognized principles. The Marine 1st Parachute Battalion, in training in 1941, acquired extra BARs and broke its squads down into 3 3-man groups with one man carrying a BAR. And Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson, with his 2nd Raider Battalion, also used the 3-man fighting groups with a lot of automatic weapons, including a lot of Thompsons. By December 1943, the Marine Corps headquarters created a board headed by Lieutenant Colonel Samuel B. Griffith to look at squad organization. It remains, in my view, one of the few occasions in history when a committee produced a work of human engineering genius. The testing started out with a 13-man squad with a squad leader and 4 3-man teams, but the committee made 2 critical changes. They endorsed the basic concept, but decided that the fire groups should be organized as 4-man teams, not 3-man teams. And second, the committee displayed with an acute sensitivity to language. As Griffith put it, instead of calling these groups fire groups, they used the word fire teams because, quote, from the psychological point of view, the use of the word team infers a unit of effort and spiritual cohesiveness that the term group does not. And the upshot was a 13-man squad, a squad leader, and 3 4-man teams with 1 man with a BAR in every team. Thus you had a squad with 3 separately constituted maneuver or fire elements and 4 designated leaders. Now this squad organization has been called the best squad organization of World War II, and coupled to the emphasis on automatic weapons and firepower at the very front edge of the assault, acted to leverage the great intangibles that the Marine Corps brought to the war. It also showed work both at the highest and the lowest levels of the Marine Corps, working in unity to maximize the effectiveness of individual Marines. Number 2. It gave the United States the greatest image of the war. I don't think I need to explain to this audience what this is all about. Iwo Jima, 23 February 1945. Joe Rosenthal, photographer for the Associated Press, had gone up to the top of the mountain. He'd been told halfway up that they'd already raised the flag because there was one flag raising had already taken place, but it was still a heck of a view. And I've been up there, and I can tell you it is one heck of a view. It's a haunting place. Rosenthal was busy trying to establish a better vantage point to take his photograph. When he caught out of the side of his eye that this was going on, he wheeled, set up, and shot without really looking through it, and in 1/400th of a second, he took this photograph. It's been called the most widely produced photograph in history. And it led to this. Now, there are 2 captions for this photograph. One caption would read, "This is the United States Marine Corps Memorial in Washington, D.C." The second caption would read, "These are the only 6 men in Washington who work together." Once more. Number. Okay. And they gave the United States the greatest memoir of World War II. Eugene Sledge was born in Mobile, Alabama. He was the son of a doctor, and by contemporary standards, he had a privileged background. His lifelong friend from boyhood was Sidney Phillips, and together they roamed the nearby Civil War battlefields. Sid's home in later life contained an arsenal of Civil War shells. Sid enlisted at 17, immediately after Pearl Harbor, and served at Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester. Eugene was initially deemed to have a heart problem, but he eventually overcame that and joined the 1st Marine Division as a replacement and served at Peleliu and Okinawa. Like the Navy, the Marines prohibited the keeping of individual diaries, but Sledge kept a pocket diary. And with the classic Southern devotion to the written word, he made notes on pages that he inserted into that diary, into that Bible. and after the war, he transformed these notes into a memoir. Years later, in 1981, that memoir was published as With the Old Breed at Peleliu in Okinawa. The book was very unheralded at publication, but then, in an extraordinary process, a number of famous historians, and by a tremendous word of mouth, the book gained wide recognition, and many, myself included, regard it as the greatest American memoir of World War II. So why does Eugene Sledge's book merit such honors? Perhaps the most distinctive thing about Sledge's memoir is that he shows rather than tells. There is no affectation whatsoever present. The prose is spare, direct, but tells a riveting story. One Marine veteran of World War II once remarked to me, the book follows the form of Dante's Inferno. It is a relentless downward spiral of one horror after another. You are at once propelled to turn the next page, but full with the knowledge that it only gets worse. The next feature, in my view, is Sledge's selflessness. The memoir dwells on his comrades, the agonies they experienced, their exemplary professionalism, their quiet but routine heroism, and their nearly unbreakable bonds of comradeship. You come to notice where Sledge speaks about himself, it is customarily to describe the important things he learned from Marine training, where his experience is but one commonly shared by his comrades. You have to read very carefully to find any passage where Sledge really highlights himself. Now, you will note that apart from Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima, I have not dwelled on individual battles or campaigns. In my judgment, Sledge's memoir is the starting point for understanding how the Marines fought the Pacific War. And let me finish with some remarks to those of you who are now early in your active duty or about to enter. You stand on very tall shoulders of those who came before you and set the standards of professionalism, perseverance, courage, and comradeship. But always remember that someday others will be standing on your shoulders. Thank you. You're safe.
Thank you. Don't go away, Richard. I'd like to give you a book. First, those were terrific remarks, and they provided superb context for our discussions here today. And I'd like you to have this book as a small token of our appreciation from the Naval Institute Press, South Pacific Cauldron, World War II's Greatest Forgotten Backgrounds by Alan Rems. Thank you, sir, very much.
Thank you.